Welcome to Readerzz, the podcast for the lifelong learner. Join us on our weekly dose of wisdom where we talk about the real-life lessons and applications of books. Enjoy! Welcome back to Readerzz, everyone. Today's episode is special. We're joined by Dr. Jeffrey L. Reynolds, an Ironman athlete, public health leader, and now two-time cancer survivor who is now the author of Every Mile Matters. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Before we kind of start, just a quick intro about the book. Every Mile Matters. It's not just a book about finishing races, right? It's about what happens when life throws you something you never signed up for. The lessons you learned from pounding out miles under the Florida sun became the same lessons that helped you face surgery, chemo, and fear with grace, right? So part one, which we're going to be discussing today, takes us from this Ironman finish line to the oncologist's office, from strength and certainty to vulnerability and surrender, and shows the exact skills that we build in pursuit of our goals can actually later be the ones that save us. So, Jeffrey, before we begin, I'd love to ask you a little bit about your journey, about the process of writing this book. Obviously, you've been through a lot, you've done a lot. Can you talk a little bit about what you've kind of been through and what motivated you to write this book in the first place?
Sure. I've worked in health and human services for 30 some odd years and always felt like, maybe I had a book inside me, but wasn't sure exactly what it would be about. But I've written literally thousands of op-eds for newspapers and that kind of thing. I blog pretty frequently. And so I always thought that maybe someday, I didn't think that it would be about this. I quite frankly thought it would be about, my journey in helping others and some of the things I saw along the way. I've worked in domestic violence, I've worked in sex crimes, HIV and AIDS, addiction, mental health, and done all of that work. And I, have encountered so many folks along the way and felt like, at some point, there'll be a book about them and about how they overcame the odds to be successful and that kind of thing. And so it wound up being more about me. And by way of background, kind of folks that are also walking similar journeys out there now. So I resolved to write the book after my second cancer diagnosis. I wrote part of it during chemo because my chemo sessions involved sitting in a chair for 6 hours. And so that gave me some time to think, to process, to write. And then I finished it. I guess it took about a year, but I finished it while on safari in South Africa. I was on safari in South Africa because after two cancer diagnoses, you think long and hard about all the things you wanted to do. And, for your audience out there, all the things you wanted to do, go do them because you're never sure what tomorrow is going to bring. So it was. It was an interesting process, I'll say, and we'll talk more about this, as we get into the book and during this session and some of the others we have planned. Some chapters came very easily. Other chapters were very, very challenging. And the chapters where I had to do more introspection as opposed to just telling a clinical tale took me longer. And so there's a chapter in the book that we'll talk about later about spirituality. And it probably took me 6 weeks to write that chapter. It's only like 15 pages. It took me 6 weeks because there were still, even at my age, unanswered questions that I had about what comes next. What does my belief system look like in terms of God and a higher power? What does my prayer practice look like and that kind of thing? And so before I could write about it and tell others about it, I had to resolve some of those questions myself. So very much a cathartic process. I'll tell you now, having it out into the world, I get lots of emails and texts from folks who track me down and say, I was recently diagnosed. Can you give me some advice or can you give me some kind of hope? And, how did you manage this and that? So, there are 2 million people a year in America that will hear the words, "You have cancer," for the first time this year, every year. And so that's a lot of folks struggling under the weight of what remains a pretty significant diagnosis. So in writing it, I felt like, look, if I've got some insights that I can share with folks and maybe lighten the load a little bit and ease some of the pain and offer some tips, then then that would be a good contribution to make to the world.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. And with that, let's dive right into part one, chapter one. You open this book with, a very cinematic moment, right? You're sitting at a red light, phone in hand. Just a few months earlier, you've crossed the finish line for Ironman in Florida, which is one of the most difficult things for people to do.
Yeah.
Um, and then you open your phone and you see the words clinically significant prostate cancer likely, right? This diagnosis that would rock anyone's world. Um, and I think this is kind of an interesting juxtaposition here because just a few months earlier, right, you look at your body as this like almost a proof of power,
Yeah.
right? Like you've trained, you've worked all this time, you've completed one of the hardest challenges of endurance almost anyone is ever able to do, right? And and then just a few months later, you see this sign that it's weakening in some ways. Um, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that moment in and of itself. What were your first thoughts? What are the first things racing through your head? And then also, going a little bit further throughout this chapter, you write about you say two things that I thought really stuck with me. I really like how almost bluntly you just and openly you just say this. You say, powering through hard things prepares you for hard things, and you say you get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? I feel like you obviously it seems as though through the process of writing this book, through what you've just written, right, it seems like you've, no pun intended, taken this in stride, right? And I feel like through these kinds of sentences or these little snippets that I've pointed out here, um, you show how your mindset, whether that's as an athlete, as a runner, has prepared you for enduring through some of these difficult moments. But can you talk a little bit more about a unique challenge like this that you weren't ever even prepared for?
Sure, sure. So, the opening cinematic moment, for folks that haven't read the book, it's a Friday morning. It's April 1st of 2022, and I'm heading down a parkway to go to a dental appointment. I get to the light and, I get a alert on my phone and I hop into my healthcare portal for NYU Langone, the place where I get care. And there's literally pages and pages of medical jargon. I don't really understand that well. But I scroll down to the punchline. I'm like, all right, let's cut to the chase. What's the deal? And as you noted, it said clinically significant prostate cancer likely. My cancer journey didn't start that day. It started with routine physical exam, where some of my blood counts were a little bit elevated, and not elevated that high, but elevated in a way that was about twice what they were the last time I went for a checkup. So I had no symptoms whatsoever, no reason to believe anything was wrong. And then I go and I get these blood test results, and then that sets off a chain of confirmatory tests. And that's where I learned the result. I don't think I included it in the book, but 10 minutes later, I'm in my dentist chair and she says to me, yeah, any changes in your medical history? And I'm like, do you have a couple hours? Let me just say no for now and get through this. And so, yeah, it was an interesting experience, just as my cancer journey didn't start that day, my athletic journey didn't start with Ironman Florida. It never does. And so, for me, it had started a few years before that. I was at a professional conference doing what people do at 2 a.m. at professional conferences. And somebody gets the bright idea and says, hey, we should run a 5K in the morning. And I'm like, all right, what could go wrong with that?
Mhm.
I show up in shoes and clothes that are not exactly appropriate for running a 5K. And the gun goes off and I take off very quickly. And a minute later, I'm out of breath and walking and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And so I'm like, oh no, and so, I did what anybody with my mindset would do. I went back to my hotel room and frantically started registering for 5Ks back at home.
Mhm.
I actually went back to that conference a couple of years later and won the 5K, won first place. But the personality is such in that 5K becomes 10K, becomes a half marathon, becomes a full marathon. I did 15 full marathons, and then it wasn't good enough to be mediocre at one sport. I needed to be mediocre at three sports, and so I took up swimming, biking, and running. And as I often joke, probably part of a midlife crisis. It was either, dye my hair, buy skinny jeans, and cruise the local community college, or or take up triathlon. And so I took up triathlon, and there too with triathlons, you start with a sprint, which is basically shorter. You move to Olympic and then a half and then the full. And the full in November 2021, Ironman Florida was really the pinnacle of success. And as you noted, it was like, wow, I trained, I did this. By the time you do it, you've put in several thousand miles on the bike, you've run several thousand miles, you've swam God knows how long. And so it's not only the race, it's all the preparation that goes into it. And, as much as you try to check yourself, you do have this feeling of invincibility. And so my first thought when I got the news was, wait, how in God's name could I have cancer? And then honestly, it struck me. So there's two things. One, health and fitness are not the same thing. You could be very fit and still have a significant health condition, and vice versa. But the other thing that struck me is as I sat thinking about it, I'm like, so when I did Ironman Florida, I had cancer. I did Ironman Florida with cancer. And so I could certainly do cancer by itself. I do these things. One of the things I like about triathlon is that there are these uncomfortable moments that happen to you where everything in your mind, everything in your body is telling you to stop. Like there's no reason to do this. This is voluntary. Nobody's chasing you. You don't have to do this thing. And you power through and you recognize, and it's almost like you acknowledge the pain, you acknowledge the discomfort, and then you put it out of your mind and you just keep going. And so that became my model for getting through this. You just keep going one step at a time. And so for me, doing Ironman Florida was a test, but it then became a testament to what was possible. I was able to draw from that and say, yeah, I do hard things. I've done hard things. If I can do this, then I can do whatever comes my way. And so, one of the great lessons out of that, and I think it works this way for kids in sports too. I'm a big proponent of kids, if they're able to, getting involved in sports in some way. And that doesn't mean you've got to be a D1, league football player. It could
Yeah.
mean something as simple as running every day. Something that clears your mind, that gets you active, that gets you thinking, but also something that builds on your success. And so, for me, I had no idea as I trained for triathlon. It was a recreational activity, something I did on the weekend. I wasn't winning any races. I wasn't coming in last either. I came in somewhere in the middle. It was something that I did to keep myself fit, to keep myself emotionally healthy and that kind of thing. And as you noted, I didn't know that there was a bigger race plan for me.
No, I mean, I love it. I think through the chapter or through this part here, you talk a lot about your journey through kind of overcoming not just obviously the physical part of what cancer is, right, but also the mental blocks that kind of held you back. And I think you bring up two really interesting points here about both vulnerability or courage, and then also just daily small growth, right? So at one point you say true masculinity isn't diminished by illness, it's defined by courage and connection, right? And I kind of want to, I would love to hear a little bit more about your process through discovering that almost this sense of vulnerability was a source of strength for you as opposed to, a weakness or surrender. And then you also say, you talk a little bit about your daily routine, your habits, right? You said my daily runs slowed to daily walks, but I knew I was still moving forward. And I would love to hear a little bit about what got you really to that kind of point because obviously when you start up here, as a runner, you just completed the Ironman, all these things, it's hard to go back to daily walks, right?
Yeah.
I know whenever I was on the basketball court and had, I don't know, an ankle injury and I had to go back to just standing, shooting free throws for hours, like that never feels good,
Right.
and I think through that process, obviously you're dealing with something a lot bigger than a sprained ankle, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own thought process and kind of the emotional journey you went through to reach these conclusions of, whether or not I'm running or walking, as long as I'm moving forward, and also that journey about with vulnerability.
The leading into, I wound up having prostate cancer surgery. I was diagnosed, I got the text message on April Fool's Day of all days and got the surgery in July. I call it Independence Weekend when I got rid of my first round of cancer. Um, the night before the surgery, I ended a 777-day running streak. I didn't plan that. I had no way of planning it was going to be 777 days. It was a lucky number. And so, it worked out that way. But for 777 consecutive days, I ran at least a mile. And sometimes I ran 10. Sometimes I ran the minimum one. There were times when, in order to complete the streak, I ran in jeans after a long day at work, or stopped my car by the side of the road, or left airports and ran outside and then came back into the airport and got my luggage. And so I did whatever it took to keep that streak up. And then that streak was broken. And, as I came to the realization, that I'm going to have surgery and there's no way I can keep the streak up, there was an element of sadness, right? It was an end to an era. I had worked hard to maintain the streak, and now it was ending, although I found some solace in that it wasn't for lack of willpower. I said to my doctor, as we scheduled the surgery, I said, will I be able to run afterwards? He's like, no. And I'm like, what will happen if I do? And he said, you're going to do a lot of damage and you're going to undo everything that I did. And it's going to just kind of lengthen this entire process out. And so I didn't run, but I walked around right after the surgery, like an hour after the surgery. I did lots of laps around the nurses station. I'm sure they felt like they should order me a psychiatric evaluation. And then in the month afterwards, I walked a ton. And every time I would come back, my wife would say to me, how'd it go? And it was pathetic, And so, I'm used to running 8-minute miles, 8.5-minute miles, and now I'm walking 14 miles. And so it took a lot of adjustment. I will say there's two things that came out of that. One, um, I felt lucky to be able to do anything at all, especially as I got further into my journey, and that, it wasn't that, I have to go out and walk 5 miles today. It was more, I get to go out and walk 5 miles today. The second thing that I noticed is there were routes in my neighborhood that I had run by thousands of times. And you get to know, so, you see garbage in a road or whatever else, or you see something that's been discarded by the side of the highway, a kid's doll or something, and you notice it every single time you go by, and those become like your mile markers. Oh, that's where the fork is, and that's where the kid's doll is, and that's where the water bottle full of pee is, and so you get to notice all these things, and you do notice them, but when you walk, you see more things. And there were times when I walked these routes instead of, blazing through them, sweating and that, and you just stop and notice things a little bit differently. You see animals you didn't see before, you notice things you didn't see before, and you think to yourself, was that always there? You notice houses as you run by that you didn't notice before. And so you really take more time, your senses are more in tune. It's more like a Zen-like kind of thing. And, there's some beauty that comes out of that. But it did take me some time to adjust to that. It's like, I can't believe it's taking me, 14 minutes to get through a mile. And this is going to take me all day now. Um, so I really had to adjust my mindset and say, so this, I don't love this. It's not great. I'd much rather be running, but what can I take from this that will be beneficial in other areas of my life? And I think one of the great lessons is you see more when you slow down.
Mm.
And also, progress isn't always a straight line. And so my running career took a couple steps back in order for me to get well and be able to move forward. But it was a pretty significant adjustment.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite parts of this book is how you're able to tie in a lot of that experience with running or cancer. A lot of these either setbacks or hurdles that a lot of people are fortunate enough not to face, or even running, which is something a lot of people don't do, but really humanize that entire process that you kind of went through, and tie it into a way of living that you've decided to live your life, right? And I think one thing you kind of mentioned in this upcoming section is you kind of translate triathlon language for all of us normal people, right? You talk about A races, B races, C races, and you translate that almost into the sense of life management, right? Which knowing which battles or races deserve full effort and which kind of just keep you moving. Um, and I want to ask a little bit about your own journey with your A races, B races, and C races. What of those, what of your journey through chemo, through cancer, through this whole process really kept you moving, and what were the ones that, you just had to kind of truck through? And what did learning to really that, like you mentioned, this process of slowing down, right? How did that kind of affect your own cadence in life?
One of the things my triathlon coach always tells me is every race can't be an A race, right? Because it doesn't work that way. Um, the other great lesson in racing, there were times when I would run C races or B races, and those are less important races, right? If you're doing a race, that is, you've done it a couple times and you're looking for a personal best, that becomes your A race. But you can't book A races week to week, right? There's got to be some B races and C races in there where you're out there, you're competing, you're hitting that start line, you're going through the process, you're hitting that finish line, but you're not necessarily leaving it all out there because then you won't be able to do it the following week or 2 weeks later. And so you go into races, with a plan. And I think that's, as important as anything else, that it's not all left to chance. It's that this is going to be a mid-range race for me. This is what I want to be able to do in the way of finishing. This is my time goal. This is how I want to feel as I'm doing it. Because there are races that you go all out and you're just wrecked at the end. And, then you're wrapped up for a week and the rest of your training is thrown into a tailspin. And so you have to really calculate out which races are the most important, but then at the same time, understand that things don't always go your way. Mother Nature doesn't care what your plans were. And so there were A races I had, including Ironman Florida, where there's wind, there's water current, there's wildlife in the water. There are things that affect your performance that have nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And so you get into this, when I did Ironman Florida, there were 450 people that were pulled out of the swim that didn't make it. And so that means your race day is over. So you spent a year preparing, you hit the swim, you didn't make the time cutoff, or you needed to be rescued, and your race is done. And you sit there for the rest of the day
Yeah.
while the rest of us are out there doing our thing. And so unexpected things happen. So part of this is saying, I'm going into this race with this mindset. I'm going into this, in life, this project, this relationship, this work, with a particular mindset, but understand that things might not go your way. It has nothing to do with your training, nothing to do with your performance. And so you always have to be ready for those curveballs. On the bike and triathlons, you run the risk of a flat, right? If you have a flat, it's probably going to take you 10 minutes to change that out. You just lost 10 minutes on your time, or, you wind up twisting an ankle coming off a curb in the run. And so there are things that happen all the time. Among athletes, we always say, if we have a lousy race and it didn't go according to plan, just today just wasn't my day. I always found some solace in the fact that, again, I wasn't going to come in first. I wasn't going to come in last. We're all getting the same medal. We're all getting the same free t-shirt and free banana at the end of it. And so it's not my day job.
Yeah.
And, safety always came first. But I think understanding, so, and the other thing, and here's another lesson. You get the race that you trained for. So there are races I did usually in the off season where, my training was sporadic. There's a daily training plan. You know when you're doing the training plan right. You know when you're doing it, in some ways half-hearted, or you're skipping workouts, or life gets in the way. And you show up at that start line and you know that you're only about 80% trained to where you wanted to be. You always wish there were 2 more weeks before the race. And if you only train to 80% of where you wanted to be, then expect 80% of that race. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't expect to have an A plus race if you trained in a B minus way. And so what you very often, not always, but what you put in is what you get out of it. Again, understanding that sometimes things beyond your control happen, and quite frankly, that's not the end of the world either.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic lesson. And I think with that, we'll wrap up part one of Every Mile Matters. I think today was incredible, right? This first six chapters of this book, it almost seems like they are in, using your runner language, forming the first lap of, a much larger race in your own life, right? And of your own transformation, of your own growth. And I think I love how you almost break this down. And this is something obviously we'll try to capture the essence of, but if whoever's listening, really, really wants to see the behind the scenes, I would highly recommend, getting this book in the first place. You talk about how the athlete learns patience, right? And the survivor learns momentum, and both almost learn the sense of humility. And that's, one of my favorite parts of kind of going through this. So I think I learned a lot. This was fantastic. Dr. Reynolds, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to part two, right? Which is where we're going to dive into how your own challenges affected your physical, your mental, your social, and even spiritual life. And obviously how you came out stronger as a result of it. So, thank you to all of our listeners. And until next time, keep on learning, keep on changing, and keep on growing. And remember, every mile matters. We'll see you next time.